She ran from shame. He promised forgiveness. But what she found inside that barn was a nightmare carved in flesh. As storm clouds gathered over Lancaster's quiet fields, Z heard the silence stretch too long. Her baby asleep in her arms, she stepped into the barn and found her husband hanging, mutilated, with a Bible verse scorched into his skin. This wasn't just a murder, it was a ritual. And it began with a forbidden love that defied generations of silence. What happens when tradition becomes a prison? When a daughter's love shatters the legacy her father spent a lifetime building? This is a story about fanaticism, betrayal, and a crime buried under centuries of obedience. Before we dive into this chilling case, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more twisted tales of love, lies, and legacy turned lethal. In the hidden farmland of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, nestled among quiet wheat fields and horse-drawn buggies, a blood-soaked secret shattered the illusion of peace in the heart of the Amish community. Behind a wall of simplicity and silence, a forbidden marriage, generational shame, and one man's fanatical devotion to purity led to a horrifying murder that stunned the nation. Bishop Eliam Shemuel Yoder was not an ordinary Amish man. At 61, he was a towering figure, both literally and spiritually, in his Ordnung-fearing community. Known for his strict adherence to doctrine, his booming sermons, and an unrelenting moral compass sharpened by trauma and generational dogma, Eliam was feared as much as he was revered. He had 16 children and over 40 grandchildren, but his favorite, the one he saw as his legacy, was his youngest daughter, 23-year-old Zipporah Yoder, whom everyone simply called Z. Z had a quiet grace about her. She wore her long hair tucked neatly beneath her cap, her eyes downcast, her voice barely above a whisper. She moved through life with the kind of practiced obedience that could only be taught, not chosen. From the moment she was born, Z was told she was special, not for who she was, but for what she represented. To Bishop Yoder, Z was not just a daughter, she was a vessel, a symbol of divine order. The final child born to his aging wife, a miracle he believed was sent by God himself to carry on the sacred Yoder legacy. The bishop's obsession with purity didn't start with Z, but it certainly ended with her. Eliam Yoder was a man forged in the fire of pain. Orphaned at a young age, raised by a cold grandfather who punished disobedience with silence, Eliam believed suffering was the pathway to salvation. He preached that joy was a temptation, and the world outside their community was a cesspool of sin. His sermons were infamous, fiery, theatrical, often laced with threats of divine punishment. Children trembled at the sound of his voice. Men straightened their spines when he walked by. Women wept in fear and awe. But behind closed doors, the bishop's control ran even deeper. He ruled his household with an iron will and a wooden rod. His wife, Miriam, once vibrant and sharp, had grown silent over the years, retreating into the safety of prayer and repetition. The older children had long fled the fold, some shunned, others vanished into the English world, their names no longer spoken at the family table. But Z remained. From her earliest years, she was molded to serve. While other girls her age giggled about courtship during quilting bees, Z was reading scriptures under candlelight, reciting verses by heart, learning how to churn butter with one hand and rock a cradle with the other. She was obedient. She was pure. She was perfect. And Eliam made sure she stayed that way. He forbade outside influence, rejected any suitor who came calling, and often told Z that God had plans for her, plans bigger than marriage. She was chosen, sanctified, set apart. Her future, he insisted, was not hers to decide. Z was soft-spoken, beautiful, and obedient. Her life was a carefully structured dance within the rigid confines of Amish tradition. She was the perfect daughter, the one her father, Bishop Eliam Shemuel Yoder, always dreamed of, a reflection of his faith, his discipline, his vision for a purer world. Z's world was simple, yet absolute. The chores, the prayers, the humble life of plainness and humility. She never questioned it. Until the moment everything she knew began to crumble. Her love story wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. She was raised to marry a man who lived by the same principles, someone who would carry the weight of the Yoder legacy alongside her. But then came Keontae Rashad Billings, and with him, the storm that would tear through everything. Keontae wasn't Amish, not by a long shot. He wasn't even from their world. He was everything they despised, a 29-year-old ex-convict with a past of armed robbery, a former hip-hop artist with tattoos, and a voice that didn't fit the silence of Lancaster's farmlands. But somewhere in the darkest corners of prison, Keontae found something the Amish could never have predicted: Christianity. The reformed man that emerged from those 6 years behind bars wasn't just a change of heart. It was a total reinvention. He joined a missionary outreach program, looking to share his faith, his journey, with anyone who would listen. And listen they did. Keontae was charismatic, magnetic in a way Z had never seen before. When they met at a church-sponsored outreach at a farmer's market on the border of Amish land, the difference between their worlds couldn't have been clearer. Z had been raised on a steady diet of butter churns and horse-drawn buggies, her life defined by the hum of daily routines, where words were carefully measured and forbidden to stray from tradition. Yet, here was this man, quoting scripture with the rhythm of a freestyle, turning parables into poetry, his voice alive with passion and rhythm. Z stood frozen in place, captivated by the way he breathed life into the very words she had been taught to revere. To her, Keontae was electric, everything her world wasn't. The contrast between her plain dress and his confidence was striking, but it was more than just the physical differences. It was the pull of something deeper, something she couldn't explain but knew she needed to explore. Her world, so stifled by its rules, suddenly felt suffocating. Despite everything she was taught, despite the glaring warnings of her family and community, Z couldn't resist. The moment she first spoke to Keontae, her heart told her everything she needed to know. She fell for him, not in some sweet, slow way, but in the reckless abandon of someone who was desperate to break free from the cage she had been raised in. In just 2 months, they eloped, running from everything she had ever known. She left behind the farm, the community, her family, dressed in plain clothes, clutching nothing but her prayer book, and disappearing into the night. The backlash was swift and brutal. Iliam Yoder, her father, disowned her. The Yoder family pronounced her maid shunned. Her name was scratched from the family Bible as if she had never existed. For the Amish, this was more than just an act of rejection. It was a spiritual defilement. A daughter who would abandon her family, her faith, her legacy, her very bloodline, was seen as lost forever. But Z, pregnant and in love, believed she had escaped her father's grip forever. She settled in suburban Harrisburg with Keontae, their new life beginning with the birth of their son, Malachi. To them, this was freedom, freedom from the chains of tradition, from the judgment of a world that never understood them. They were building something new, something of their own. But the world would not let them forget. 6 months into their marriage, things seemed to be going well. Keontae had rebranded himself as the Urban Apostle, a name that echoed through the internet like a battle cry. With each passing day, his podcast was gaining more listeners, his voice growing louder, filled with opinions about race, sex, and religion. Keontae wasn't just talking about faith anymore. He was turning it into a performance, a spectacle. His podcast wasn't about salvation. It was about tearing down everything that could be torn, including the very idea of purity he knew Z had been raised with. One night, after a few too many beers and a sense of invincibility, Keontae decided to get real. He uploaded a live stream titled, "My Wife Was a Virgin," and it was trash. What followed was something Z never could have prepared for. Keontae laughed as he recounted intimate details of their first night together, mocking the very thing that had been instilled in Z from birth: purity, modesty, and devotion. He laughed at her inexperience, calling her clueless in the bedroom, mocking her awkwardness during sex, the way she cried that night. He scoffed at her discomfort with oral sex, saying, "Y'all think y'all want a virgin till you get one. Ain't nothing sexy about missionary with a mannequin." The words hung in the air, a haunting melody of humiliation. But what made it worse was the video. Z's face, that sweet, soft, plain face that had been kept hidden behind bonnets and modesty, was right there, raw and exposed, no makeup, no mask. She was begging him to stop, pleading through tears as the whole world watched her pain unfold on the screen. She was helpless, trapped in her own home as her husband laughed at her vulnerability, her innocence, her purity. She begged him to stop. Her voice, hoarse and desperate, echoed in the background as Keontae shrugged her off, dismissing her discomfort as emotionally colonized by Puritan nonsense. His words were like daggers, cutting deeper with each mocking laugh. He reveled in the power he had over her, in the control he wielded as the world watched him tear her down. And it didn't stop there. That video, those cruel words, went viral. It spread across the internet like wildfire. What Keontae had intended as a moment of realness turned into a viral nightmare. The clip was shared, reposted, and rewatched by thousands, even millions. The most haunting part was how it found its way back into the very community Keontae had been so eager to escape. Amish youth, some of them with secret smartphones hidden away in the folds of their simple clothes, shared the video. The Ordnung, the group's governing body, caught wind of it. For the Yoder family, this wasn't just a betrayal, it was something much worse. It was a spiritual defilement, a scar on the family name. Their faith, their rules, their way of life had been mocked. The Amish held purity as sacred, and Keontae's laughter had turned that sacredness into something cheap, something disposable. For Z's father, Bishop Yoder, this was a grave insult. He saw it as an affront to God himself. Z, who had already been cast out of her family, was now caught between the betrayal of the man she had loved and the devastation of losing her identity. The Amish world she had fled, thinking it was behind her, had now come crashing back in, more invasive and more punishing than ever before. The video wasn't just an attack on her, it was an attack on everything she had known. It was the ultimate humiliation. Her heart shattered. She couldn't escape the way the world now saw her. The whispers, the stares, the judgment, it was everywhere. It felt like her entire existence had been reduced to that one viral clip. No longer just a woman in the background of her husband's success, but a symbol of shame. She had become the punchline in a joke that Keontae had made at her expense, and the world was laughing along with him. Z, isolated and trapped in the whirlwind of her new life, tried to salvage what was left of her dignity. But each time someone recognized her from the video, each time her name was spoken in the same breath as the ridicule, it felt like another piece of her soul was chipped away. She tried to hold on to the hope that her father might one day forgive her, but deep down, she knew that what Keontae had done couldn't be undone. The scars would never fade. The Yoder family couldn't ignore it either. The betrayal cut deep, and for Yoder, it was as if his daughter had spat in the face of everything he had worked for. His righteous anger festered, and the seed of vengeance began to grow in his heart. His eyes, once filled with the love of a father, now burned with the fury of a man who believed that something sacred had been desecrated. What happened next would forever change the course of Z's life. But at that moment, there was no way for her to know the darkness her father was preparing to unleash. The echoes of that viral clip haunted her every step. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal that could never be washed away. And now, it was about to lead to something even more devastating than Z could ever have imagined. Bishop Yoder had waited, watched, and prayed. His heart had burned with the kind of righteous anger that could only be birthed from the deepest betrayal. Yet, as the days stretched on, something shifted. The bitter seed of vengeance slowly began to twist into something else. It was not forgiveness he offered. It was something darker, more calculated, and ultimately more devastating. He reached out, not directly, but through Z's estranged brother. The message was clear. He wanted to reconcile. He claimed that he had come to understand the depth of his pride, that he had been wrong in turning his back on Z and her family. He said he wanted to meet his grandson, Malachi. The words were soft, almost pleading, as if they had been spoken under the weight of heavy conviction. Z, raw and desperate for the comfort of the only family she had left, felt a glimmer of hope. She had always yearned for her father's approval, for the love that had been withheld from her the moment she left the Amish faith. Her heart was fragile, splintered from the pain of Keontae's cruelty, and now her father, the man who had once raised her with such stern love, seemed to offer an olive branch. Keontae was suspicious, but the thought of reconciliation, of showing that they were not ashamed of their love, appealed to him. He had always been the one to defy expectations, to challenge authority, and now he saw an opportunity to assert his dominance, to prove that he was in control. "Let's show them we ain't ashamed," he told Z, his voice laced with determination. And so, despite the quiet nagging at the back of his mind, they packed up Malachi and drove toward the Yoder family farm, with the promise of peace hanging like a thin thread between them. As they arrived, the sky above them was heavy, thick with dark, swirling storm clouds. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Ilium was waiting at the entrance, his figure tall and imposing, yet his embrace was warm, too long. Z could feel his grief in the way he held her, in the way he whispered, "God has shown me the error of my pride, daughter." She stiffened, but the tenderness in his touch reminded her of what she had longed for, what she had once known to be true. She allowed herself to soften, to believe, if only for a moment, that this could be the healing she had prayed for. Ilium's tears fell as he cradled Malachi in his arms, the sight of his grandson seemingly breaking the hard shell of a man who had spent his life focused on duty and discipline. "May God break the curse in his blood," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Z didn't fully understand what he meant, but the words wrapped around her heart like a gentle balm. Maybe this was the reconciliation she had been seeking. Maybe they could heal. Keontae, ever the skeptic, remained distant, yet he agreed to Ilium's request to help fix a barn door. He wanted to prove that he wasn't afraid of the farm life, that he could play the part of the dutiful son-in-law, even if the idea of working under Ilium's watchful eye filled him with a strange unease. With a grunt, he followed Ilium to the barn, leaving Z alone with Malachi inside the house. The quiet of the farm seemed to press down on her, suffocating her with its weight. As she nursed the baby, she could hear the faint sound of horses whinnying in the distance, a reminder that this place, this life, was far removed from the world she had chosen. Then, silence. The stillness stretched on for hours, far longer than she had anticipated. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, the storm clouds looming closer. Z felt a cold prickle of dread creeping up her spine, but she pushed it aside. Surely, everything was fine. Keontae was just working. But as the minutes turned into an hour, then 2, then 3, her sense of unease grew, gnawing at her from the inside. When she finally stood up to check on him, the house felt oppressively quiet. The storm had rolled in, and the wind howled through the trees outside. Z wrapped Malachi in a blanket, her heart racing, and made her way toward the barn. She called out for Keontae, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. She quickened her pace, her instincts telling her that something was terribly wrong. It was when she entered the barn that her world shattered. There, hanging from the rafters, was Keontae. His body swayed in the breeze, lifeless and limp. His pants were around his ankles, exposing his vulnerability in a way that felt like a cruel mockery of everything he had once mocked in her. Barbed wire was wrapped around his neck, cutting into the skin. But it was the fishing line, the sewing of his lips shut, that made her blood run cold. He had been silenced, not just by death, but by the hands of someone who had wanted to make him suffer. A hand-carved sign dangled from his body, swaying gently with the wind. The words were simple, but they burned into Z's mind. Shame returns to the flesh from whence it came. The meaning was clear. The shame he had forced upon her, the shame he had broadcasted to the world, had come back to him, full circle. But that wasn't all. Across his chest, branded into his flesh, was a verse from Leviticus 20 verse 13. The scripture was unmistakable, a mark of condemnation. If a man also lie with mankind, as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. The mark was not just a punishment. It was a statement, a declaration that Keontae had defiled something sacred, something unclean. Z stood frozen in horror, her body shaking, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The sight before her was too grotesque, too horrific. And as her eyes scanned the scene, she realized the full weight of what had just occurred. This was no ordinary act of violence. This was a message, a warning. Her father had never intended for reconciliation. What he had planned was something far darker, something that would leave a mark on her soul that would never fade. The investigation began in the shadows, as the police trudged through the thick fog of Amish silence, their presence unwelcome and their questions met with a wall of resistance. The Yoder family, rooted deeply in their faith, had always kept their distance from the outside world. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes never meeting those of the officers, their doors closed tightly to any form of intrusion. When the body was discovered, it was clear that the scene was not just a murder, it was a message that the police were struggling to decipher. Detective Larson, an experienced officer with more than 20 years under his belt, stood in the barn, his eyes scanning the grotesque scene. The body was still hanging. Edie made his report. Keontae had been tortured post-mortem. The barbed wire had been wound tightly around his neck, suffocating him slowly, almost painfully. His lips sewn shut, a cruel, calculated touch, left the unmistakable imprint of his tormentor's rage. The death had not been swift. It had been brutal, agonizing, and deliberate. The kind of death that left behind echoes of something far darker than a mere crime of passion. Z had been the one to find him. The one who had stumbled upon her husband, hanging lifeless from the rafters, his body a symbol of everything he had mocked and betrayed. When the officers arrived, she was still there, her hands bloodied from trying to cut him down. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale and gaunt, the shock of the moment still rattling through her body. She didn't speak at first, unable to form the words. But when she did, her voice cracked under the weight of grief. I tried to save him, she whispered, her breath trembling. I didn't know. I didn't know it would be like this. Her hands, trembling as she spoke, were covered in his blood. There was no hiding it, no pretending that she had not been a part of the aftermath. She had tried to cut him down, to stop what had been done, but it had been too late. By the time she arrived, Keontae had already been lost to the twisted hands of his executioner. The police officers took her statement, their eyes not just questioning, but searching for something deeper. There was no doubt in their minds that Z had been a victim, but the layers of secrecy surrounding the Yoder family and their faith weighed heavily on the investigation. The Amish didn't speak openly about their beliefs, their practices, or their rituals. To them, the outside world was an enemy, and this crime had brought that world crashing into their quiet, insulated lives. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a calculated act of vengeance. The medical examiner's report detailed the cruelty of Keontae's final moments, but it was the discovery of Eliam Yoder's journals that began to paint a more sinister picture. The journals were found in Eliam's prayer room, tucked away behind a locked drawer, hidden beneath religious texts and the remnants of old prayers. They were pages of rage, of meticulous planning, and of a father's twisted sense of justice. The ink on the pages was still fresh, and the words were scrawled in a hurried, almost feverish hand. In one of the passages Eliam had written, he mocked her temple. He laughed at her sanctity. I will return the laughter with silence. The words were chilling, a manifesto of sorts, a justification for the horror that had been visited upon Keontae. It became clear that Eliam saw Keontae not just as a son-in-law but as an abomination, a man who had defiled his daughter in ways too grotesque to comprehend. To him, Keontae's mockery of Z's innocence, his exploitation of her in such a public, humiliating way, had been unforgivable. And so, Eliam had planned, patiently, methodically, to cleanse the family of the sin he believed Keontae had inflicted upon them. This wasn't just a murder, it was an execution, a retribution for a perceived spiritual violation. But there was more. A USB drive, found tucked inside the pages of one of the journals, was the final nail in the coffin. It was labeled The Defilement, a fitting title for what was contained within. The contents were a damning collection of videos and recordings. Among them was the infamous podcast episode, the one where Keontae had mocked Z so cruelly, broadcasting her most intimate vulnerabilities to the world. The audio was edited, spliced together to emphasize the worst of his taunts, the worst of his cruelty. Z's cries, her pleas for him to stop, echoed through the recording, and the twisted laughter of Keontae, as he spoke of his wife's innocence as though it were a joke, rang out over the speakers. The video wasn't just a confession, it was evidence of a crime. But it was more than that. It was the final piece of the puzzle, a sickening confirmation that Eliam's actions had been years in the making. He had watched his daughter suffer, and with each passing day, his anger had festered, culminating in the brutal act of vengeance that had claimed Keontae's life. As the investigation moved forward, the police uncovered more fragments of this dark puzzle, more writings, more videos, more hints of a twisted ideology that justified murder in the name of righteousness. The Amish community remained tight-lipped, protective of their own, but the evidence was piling up, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for them to deny the truth. Z, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The man she had once loved was gone, his death a brutal reminder of the consequences of her escape from the world she had once known. Her heart ached with the weight of grief, but there was no escaping the truth. Her father had been the one to end Keontae's life. And as much as she wanted to believe in the purity of her father's motives, she couldn't shake the feeling that, in the end, he had sacrificed Keontae for his own twisted sense of justice. The executioner had spoken, and now there would be no silence left for any of them. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with spectators, reporters, and members of the Amish community who had traveled in secret to witness the trial. Outside, the world had been watching the trial unfold, captivated by the brutality of the crime and the twisted family drama that had led to it. Inside, the tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation as the case reached its apex. Z, the heart of the trial, sat at the witness stand, her face pale, her hands trembling. She had been through so much, yet somehow, she still wasn't prepared for the weight of the courtroom's gaze. The full weight of what had happened to Keontae seemed to hit her all over again, and the raw emotion surged through her like a tidal wave. She wiped her eyes, trying to steady herself as the prosecutor, a woman named Linda Hayes, stood beside her. The silence in the room was deafening, every eye on her. The viral video that had shattered her life was shown on the big screen, the courtroom watching in stunned silence as the footage played. The footage was unbearable, a gut-wrenching reminder of the humiliation she had suffered at his hands. The gasps from the audience were audible, the horror on their faces mirrored in the faces of the jury. But it wasn't just the video that left the courtroom reeling. It was the man who sat across from Z. Eliam Yoder, the patriarch, the father who had orchestrated the execution of his own son-in-law, was unmoved. He sat there, his face cold and emotionless, as if nothing had happened. His eyes were fixed ahead, his hands clasped neatly on the table before him. There was no remorse in his expression, no sign of regret. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was calm, almost detached. "I regret not doing it sooner," Eliam said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. His statement sent a ripple through the room, a shockwave that made some of the jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. There was only a cold, unwavering conviction in his eyes. To him, what he had done was justified, righteous even. He believed he had purified his daughter's life, that Keontae's death was the ultimate form of atonement for the sins he believed had been inflicted upon their family. The jury's reaction was swift. They had seen enough. The deliberation lasted mere hours. The evidence was damning, the cruelty undeniable. Eliam's own words sealed his fate, and when the verdict was read, it rang out like a death knell. Guilty on all counts, murder, torture, and kidnapping, the judge announced, his voice firm and resolute. There was no leniency here, no mercy. Eliam's cold stare remained fixed, even as the full weight of the law descended upon him. The judge paused, his gavel poised in the air. He looked down at Eliam, who had spent his life leading the Amish community, living under the guise of righteousness and holiness. Now, he was nothing more than a man convicted of heinous acts. You, the judge said, his voice carrying the full force of the courtroom, are a self-anointed executioner of shame. You took it upon yourself to dispense your twisted sense of justice, to impose your beliefs on your own flesh and blood. For that, you will never see freedom again. The gavel fell, and Eliam was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Z stood frozen, her eyes glazed over. She had fought for justice, but she didn't feel victorious. No sentence, no verdict, could erase what had happened to her. Keontae was gone. Her father was locked away, and her world, already shattered, seemed irreparably broken. As the officers led Eliam away in handcuffs, the courtroom erupted into a mix of whispers and murmurs. But for Z, the noise of the outside world faded into nothing. She had been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect her, and now she had to figure out how to rebuild her life from the ashes of everything that had been lost. Keontae humiliated Z. Eliam destroyed her. One man mocked her body. The other twisted her grief into a ritual of punishment. In the clash between modern freedom and ancient control, love became collateral. Was Eliam seeking justice or vengeance? Can purity become poison when weaponized in the name of God? If this story left you shaken, subscribe, because sometimes the deepest sins are committed in the name of righteousness.